Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Colorado. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the harsh winter of 1869, the small mining settlement of Blackhawk, Colorado, nestled in what was then Gilpin County, saw the establishment of a modest boarding house on the northern edge of town. It stood 3 stories tall, with peeling white paint, positioned advantageously on a small rise overlooking both the town's main street and the mines beyond. The structure had been purchased by 2 sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth Wakefield, who had traveled west from Pennsylvania following the death of their parents. According to county records filed on December 3, 1869, the sisters paid cash for the property, an unusual transaction that raised few questions in a boomtown where fortunes were made and lost daily in the gold mines. The Wakefield boarding house, as it came to be known, quickly developed a reputation for cleanliness and proper accommodations, rare qualities in mining communities of that era. Margaret, the elder at 32, managed the finances and public dealings, while Elizabeth, 7 years her junior, oversaw the cooking and maintenance. The sisters kept to themselves, but were regarded as respectable businesswomen by the townspeople. Within 6 months, their establishment housed 12 permanent boarders, all men working the nearby mines, and occasionally provided temporary lodging for travelers passing through. What made the Wakefield sisters unusual was not merely their venture as unaccompanied women in the frontier, but the peculiar conditions they imposed upon their boarders. According to town gossip documented in the diary of Mary Hollister, wife of the local apothecary, the sisters required their tenants to observe strict hours of silence, prohibited alcohol on the premises, and insisted that all boarders attend Sunday services at the newly constructed Methodist church. Most notably, no women were permitted to visit the boarders' rooms at any time, a rule that became increasingly strict as the months passed. According to church records preserved at the Colorado Historical Society, both sisters were regular attendees at Sunday services, though they rarely participated in other church functions. Reverend Jonathan Whitmore noted in his parish register that Margaret frequently remained after services to discuss scriptural interpretations, displaying what he described as an unusual preoccupation with passages concerning purification and the cleansing of sin. Elizabeth, by contrast, rarely spoke but was observed to watch the congregation with intense scrutiny. The town of Blackhawk itself was typical of mining settlements that had sprung up throughout Colorado following the Pikes Peak gold rush of 1859. By 1869, it had evolved from a cluster of tents and rough cabins to a more established community with approximately 500 permanent residents. A main street boasted several businesses: a general store, 2 saloons, a rudimentary hotel, a blacksmith shop, and the aforementioned apothecary. The mining company had constructed an office and processing facility on the western edge of town, closest to the mines that provided the settlement's economic foundation. Life in such communities was harsh and often brief. Men died regularly in mining accidents, from disease, or in the frequent conflicts that erupted in the saloons. Women were scarce, comprising less than 20% of the population, and were generally wives of merchants or laborers rather than independent businesswomen. This context made the Wakefield sisters' enterprise all the more remarkable, and perhaps explains why their eccentricities were tolerated with minimal comment. The winter of 1869-1870 passed without incident at the boarding house. The sisters established routines that would later be described by survivors as almost ritualistic in their precision. Breakfast was served promptly at 5:30 a.m., allowing the miners time to reach their shifts by first light. Dinner was laid out at 7 p.m. after the men had returned and washed away the day's grime in basins of heated water provided by Elizabeth. Margaret collected rent every Friday evening, recording payments in a leather-bound ledger with meticulous attention to detail. A letter from one early boarder, Michael Donovan, to his sister in Boston, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives and discovered during research for a 1965 doctoral dissertation on frontier migration, describes the boarding house during this initial period. The accommodations exceed my expectations, though life here bears little resemblance to our home in Dorchester. The sisters who own this establishment maintain standards of cleanliness that would impress even Mother. My room, though small, contains a comfortable bed, a writing desk, and a view of the mountains that compensates for many discomforts. The elder Miss Wakefield runs the house with military precision, and her young sister watches us all with eyes that seem to miss nothing. We are fed well, if plainly, and the absence of spirits promotes a more civilized atmosphere than one finds in the town's other establishments. I find I sleep more soundly here than I have since leaving home, though I confess to strange dreams that I attribute to the high altitude. Donovan's letter represents the only first-hand account of life in the boarding house before the disappearances began. He himself departed Blackhawk in March of 1870, having secured more lucrative employment with a surveying team heading north. His subsequent correspondence confirms that he left of his own volition and maintained fond memories of his time at the Wakefield boarding house, a stark contrast to the experiences of those who remained. In April of 1870, the first disappearance occurred. Samuel Thatcher, a 26-year-old mine worker from Ohio who had been living at the boarding house since January, failed to report for his shift. His absence was noted by his foreman, who sent word to the Wakefield boarding house. Margaret Wakefield reportedly expressed minimal concern, stating that Thatcher had settled his account the previous evening and mentioned plans to try his luck further west. No formal report was filed. The incident might have been forgotten entirely had it not been for what followed. Tax records indicate that Thatcher had been employed at the Blackhawk Mining Company for approximately 9 months prior to his disappearance. His personnel file, partially recovered after the 1872 fire, described him as reliable but reserved, and noted that he had no known family in the territory. A single photograph, included with his initial employment documents, shows a thin-faced young man with deep-set eyes and a solemn expression, one of countless anonymous laborers who sought fortune in the Western Territories. Between April and November of 1870, 3 more boarders vacated their rooms without notice. Each time, Margaret Wakefield provided similar explanations. The men had settled their accounts and moved on to other opportunities. In a frontier community with a transient population, such occurrences hardly warranted investigation. Men frequently abandoned their claims or employment to chase rumors of better prospects elsewhere. The sisters' boarding house maintained its respectable reputation, and new tenants quickly filled the vacated rooms. The subsequent disappearances followed a pattern that would only become apparent in retrospect. The second man to vanish was Frederick Müller, a German immigrant who had worked in the mines for just over a year. According to mining company records, Miller was a skilled timberman responsible for shoring up tunnel supports, a critical and relatively well-paid position. His disappearance in June 1870 was explained by Margaret as a decision to join a cousin's brewing venture in Denver. No such business was ever located in subsequent investigations. In August, boarder James Wilson reportedly departed for California after hearing tales of agricultural opportunities in the Sacramento Valley. Wilson, unlike the others, had been vocal about his dislike of mining and his hope to return to farming, making his supposed departure plausible to those who knew him. The fourth man, whose name appears in Margaret's ledger as Thomas Brooks, vanished in early November. His absence was attributed to a letter from home, requiring his immediate return to Kentucky, a common enough occurrence that raised no suspicions. What nobody in Blackhawk seemed to notice, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, was that none of the departed men had collected their final wages from the mining company. This detail would not come to light until much later, when a clerk at the Blackhawk Mining Company compiled records for the quarterly payroll and noted the unclaimed funds. By then, the pattern had been established, though its significance remained obscured. Another overlooked detail was recorded in the journal of Dr. William Foster, who noted that each disappearance had been preceded by a period of declining health in the affected individual. Foster had treated Miller for nervous exhaustion approximately 2 weeks before his disappearance, observing that the man appeared unusually pale and complained of weakness that the doctor attributed to the poor ventilation in the mines. Similar symptoms had been reported by Wilson during a brief consultation in July. These connections would only be recognized after the full scope of the sisters' activities came to light. The winter of 1870-1871 was particularly severe in the Colorado mountains. Heavy snowfall isolated the mining communities for weeks at a time. The Wakefield Boardinghouse took on an eerie quality during this period, according to accounts from townspeople. Smoke rose constantly from its 3 chimneys, yet the windows remained dark most evenings. The sisters were rarely seen in town, sending a local boy to collect supplies once weekly. When questioned about the welfare of their boarders, they simply stated that all were present and accounted for, preferring to remain indoors during the bitter weather. This period coincides with what investigators would later identify as the most active phase of the sisters' operation. Elizabeth's journal entries from December 1870 through February 1871 describe in clinical detail the treatment of 5 men, though only 3 additional disappearances were officially noted in the spring. The discrepancy suggests that some victims may have been transient boarders whose absences went unreported, or that the sisters had developed methods of disposing of bodies while maintaining the appearance of a full house. The snow that winter accumulated to depths of over 6 feet in some areas, effectively sealing the community off from outside contact for nearly 6 weeks. Food supplies dwindled, and many residents subsisted on preserved goods and whatever game could be hunted in the surrounding forests. The mining company temporarily suspended operations in January due to the impossibility of transporting ore to processing facilities. Yet, according to delivery records from the general store, the Wakefield sisters continued to purchase substantial quantities of food throughout this period, quantities that, in retrospect, appear excessive for the number of boarders officially registered. Most telling is an entry in Elizabeth's journal dated January 17, 1871. The prolonged isolation provides ideal conditions for extended observation. Subject C has been maintained in a sedated state for 12 days with minimal nutrition. The progressive effects of bloodletting are most instructive. I have modified the formula to include additional mineral components, which appear to expedite the separation of moral corruption from the physical vessel. By spring thaw, the population of the boarding house had seemingly diminished, though precise numbers were difficult to ascertain. The sisters became increasingly private, drawing their curtains even during daylight hours and declining invitations to community gatherings. Their boarders, once visible figures walking to and from the mines, were now rarely seen in groups. When encountered individually, they appeared thin and spoke little, hurrying about their business with downcast eyes. A notice published in the Central City Register, the nearest town with a newspaper, on April 3, 1871, advertised vacancies at the Wakefield Boarding House, the first such advertisement since the establishment's opening. This suggests that the sisters may have exhausted the supply of suitable victims among their existing tenants and sought to replenish their ranks. The advertisement emphasized moral accommodations for respectable single gentlemen and healthful conditions conducive to physical and spiritual well-being. In June of 1871, Dr. William Foster, the town's only physician, was called to the boarding house to attend to a tenant suffering from a mining injury. In his medical log, preserved in the Colorado Historical Society archives, Foster described the boarding house interior as immaculately maintained, yet pervaded by an atmosphere of profound silence. He noted that despite it being midday, The hallways were kept unnaturally dark, with heavy drapes covering most windows. The injured miner, whose name was recorded as James Cooper, exhibited a crushed hand consistent with mining accidents of that era. However, Foster observed that the injury appeared several days old and had begun to show signs of infection, suggesting that medical attention had been delayed. Most telling was Foster's description of Cooper's quarters: a room of monastic simplicity, no personal effects visible, bed linens excessively clean, as though recently changed, no photographs, letters, or mementos that one typically observes in a working man's lodgings. When questioned about his people back east, the patient grew agitated, and the elder Miss Wakefield promptly terminated our conversation. Foster attempted to insist that Cooper be moved to his clinic for proper treatment, but Margaret Wakefield refused, stating that her sister was perfectly capable of changing bandages and administering the prescribed medications. The doctor departed with misgivings, but had no authority to override her decision. 3 days later, Margaret Wakefield informed the mining company that Cooper had succumbed to his injuries. No autopsy was performed, and the body was buried in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The headstone, a simple marker documented in a survey conducted in 1905, bore only his name and the year 1871. What Foster could not have known was that Cooper represented a departure from the sisters' usual methodology. Elizabeth's journal entry concerning his case reveals that his injury had presented an unexpected opportunity. The damaged limb provides ideal circumstances for more aggressive intervention. Standard treatment would inevitably result in amputation, whereas our methods may demonstrate superior efficacy. Expresses concern about the doctor's interest, but has agreed to allow the experiment to proceed. The subsequent entry, dated 3 days later, expresses disappointment. Subject proved inadequately robust for the procedure. Contamination of the bloodstream occurred more rapidly than anticipated, resulting in premature termination. Refinements to the technique are required. M. Has arranged for conventional disposal, which presents certain risks but maintains our standing in the community. Future subjects must be selected with greater attention to physical constitution. By autumn of 1871, rumors about the Wakefield Boardinghouse had begun to circulate through Blackhawk. A schoolteacher named Sarah Pemberton recorded in her personal correspondence that the sisters were said to inspect the boarders' rooms daily during working hours, confiscating any items they deemed inappropriate. One miner claimed to have seen Elizabeth Wakefield burning papers behind the house after such an inspection. Another reported hearing sounds of movement from the attic late at night, though the sisters insisted that the space was used only for storage and remained locked at all times. The Methodist Church records indicate that Margaret Wakefield's attendance at services became less regular during this period, while Elizabeth ceased attending altogether. Reverend Whitmore noted his concern in a margin of his parish register, writing that Margaret had begun to express heterodox views regarding the nature of sin and its physical manifestation. He recorded a troubling conversation in which she had described certain individuals as vessels of corruption requiring intervention beyond spiritual guidance. The mining company payroll records from September through November 1871 show a troubling anomaly. Of the 12 men listed as residents of the Wakefield Boardinghouse, only 7 regularly collected their wages. When questioned by the payroll clerk, these men claimed to be delivering the funds to their housemates who were indisposed due to illness or other obligations. The clerk, finding nothing officially improper about the arrangement, made note of it but took no further action. In December of 1871, a mining engineer from Denver arrived to assess several claims in the area. Having no prior knowledge of local rumors, he secured lodging at the Wakefield Boardinghouse for what was intended to be a 2-week stay. His name was Thomas Grayson, and his detailed journal, discovered during a library archival project in 1962, provides the most comprehensive account of the boardinghouse's interior operations. Grayson was 39 years old educated at the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale, and had extensive experience in mining operations throughout the Western Territories. His employment with a Denver-based investment consortium brought him to Blackhawk to evaluate the potential expansion of existing claims. Grayson described Margaret Wakefield as a woman of severe countenance whose attempts at pleasantry never reach her eyes. Her sister Elizabeth he found more disturbing still, noting that she moves through the house like a shadow, speaking only when directly addressed, and even then in such low tones that one must lean forward to catch her words. The other boarders, all miners or laborers, maintained what Grayson called a conspiracy of silence, conversing only about practical matters and dispersing immediately after the evening meal. As an outsider with professional credentials, he represented a departure from the sisters' usual targets, a fact that may explain his survival and the preservation of his observations. His initial impressions of the physical space echo Dr. Foster's observations. The house itself presents a curious contradiction. Its public areas, the parlor, dining room, and entrance hall, are maintained with fanatical attention to cleanliness and order. Yet there is something sterile in this perfection, as though these rooms serve as a theatrical backdrop rather than living spaces. The air carries a faint medicinal scent beneath the expected aromas of cooking and coal smoke. Most striking is the absence of natural light. Heavy draperies shroud all windows, and lamps are kept at minimal illumination even during daylight hours. On his third night at the boarding house, Grayson was awakened by what he described as a sound of dragging, as though a heavy object were being pulled across the floor above. This was followed by footsteps on the stairs and the distinct creak of the back door opening and closing. Curious, he approached his window in time to observe Elizabeth Wakefield crossing the yard toward a small outbuilding carrying a lantern. She remained there for approximately 20 minutes before returning to the house. Grayson noted that she appeared to be wearing a different dress upon her return, though in the dim light he could not be certain. The following morning, Margaret Wakefield informed the boarders that one of their number, a man named Erickson, had departed during the night after receiving news of a family emergency. When Grayson casually mentioned having heard movement, Margaret fixed him with what he described as a gaze of such penetrating intensity that I found myself unable to maintain eye contact. She explained that her sister often suffered from insomnia and occupied herself with household tasks during sleepless nights. The subject was not raised again. Grayson's journal records his growing suspicion that Erickson's departure had been fabricated. No coach or rider arrived during the night to deliver this supposed urgent news, nor did I hear the sound of a horse departing, sounds that would carry clearly in the mountain stillness. Moreover, I had conversed briefly with E. the previous evening as we retired to our rooms. He mentioned his intention to accompany me on my survey of the eastern claim, expressing particular interest in my theodolite, which he had never before seen in operation. He gave no indication of anticipated news, nor displayed any anxiety. Over the next several days, Grayson became increasingly uneasy. He noted that meals were served at precisely the same time each day, with the same portions allocated to each boarder. The food, while adequate, was bland and uniform. Conversation was minimal and carefully monitored by Margaret, who would clear her throat softly whenever discussion veered toward personal matters or life outside the boarding house. Most concerning to Grayson was the behavior of the other residents, whom he described as men who have surrendered their individuality to routine. His engineering background led him to observe details that might have escaped a less technical mind. The water consumption of this establishment far exceeds what would be expected for the number of residents and the observed activities. The sisters maintain a copper boiler in near constant operation, heating quantities of water that suggest either extraordinary cleanliness or some undisclosed purpose. Similarly, their consumption of certain supplies, particularly salt, alcohol, and various powders obtained from the apothecary, appears excessive for normal household operations. On the 7th night of his stay, Grayson was awakened by a sound from the neighboring room, a series of muffled thumps followed by what he believed to be a stifled cry. He rose and pressed his ear to the wall, hearing what seemed to be a brief struggle, followed by silence. Concerned, he stepped into the hallway, just as Elizabeth Wakefield emerged from the room in question. According to Grayson's account, she carried a small basin covered with a cloth. Upon seeing me, she halted momentarily, her face betraying neither surprise nor guilt, but rather a cold assessment. She inclined her head slightly as though acknowledging my presence, then proceeded down the hallway toward the back stairs. I remained motionless until she had disappeared from view, seized by an inexplicable dread that prevented me from speaking or following. The next morning, the boarder from the neighboring room was absent from breakfast. Margaret Wakefield announced that he had been called away suddenly to assist a cousin in Denver. When Grayson inquired as to when the man had departed, she replied, "Very early, before first light." He was most apologetic about any disturbance. The remaining boarders accepted this explanation without comment, their eyes fixed on their plates. Grayson's journal reveals his internal conflict. I find myself in the impossible position of suspecting most grievous wrongdoing, yet possessing no evidence that would justify external intervention. The behavior I have witnessed, while undeniably strange, falls short of demonstrable criminality. The sisters maintain an air of religious propriety that would lend credibility to their explanations in the eyes of local authorities. Yet I cannot dispel the conviction that something unwholesome transpires within these walls, something that may explain the hollow-eyed compliance of the remaining boarders. Grayson completed his survey work as quickly as possible and departed the boarding house after only 10 days, despite having paid for a full fortnight's lodging. In his journal he wrote, "I cannot articulate precisely what transpires within those walls, but I am convinced that something unwholesome occurs beneath the veneer of propriety the Wakefield sisters so carefully maintain. The men who reside there appear diminished somehow, as though gradually being drained of vitality. I find myself reluctant to sleep deeply, and have taken to wedging a chair beneath my doorknob. Tomorrow I shall remove to the hotel in Central City, regardless of its inferior accommodation." Upon returning to Denver, Grayson debated whether to report his concerns to authorities. He ultimately decided against formal action, reasoning that his observations, while disturbing, did not constitute proof of criminal activity. Instead, he documented his experience in detail and shared his concerns with a colleague at the mining consortium who had connections in Gilpin County. This conversation, recounted in a letter Grayson wrote to his brother in Connecticut, may have indirectly influenced subsequent events by planting seeds of suspicion among those with business interests in the area. The winter of 1871 to 1872 brought another period of isolation to Blackhawk, though less severe than the previous year. Mining operations continued with minimal interruption, and the town maintained regular communication with neighboring settlements. The Wakefield boarding house operated with apparent normalcy, though townspeople later recalled that the sisters were seen even less frequently than before. Elizabeth, in particular, was rarely observed outside the property boundaries. Church records indicate that Margaret Wakefield ceased attending services entirely after Christmas 1871. When Reverend Whitmore called at the boarding house to inquire after her spiritual welfare, he was received in the parlor, but not permitted further entry. In his parish notes, he described Margaret as altered in countenance, her former severity, now edged with a feverish intensity I found most disconcerting. She explained her absence as necessary due to her sister's declining health, which required constant attention. The Reverend offered prayers for Elizabeth's recovery, but noted that Margaret received this gesture with what he perceived as barely concealed impatience. In March of 1872, a significant development occurred that would later provide crucial insight into the Wakefield boarding house. A fire broke out in the mining company office, destroying many of the recent employment and payroll records. During the community effort to salvage what remained, a clerk named Harold Williams was overheard remarking on the strange coincidence that so many men from the Wakefield boarding house had left without collecting their wages. The comment caught the attention of Sheriff Robert Buchanan, who had recently taken office following the death of his predecessor. Buchanan, a methodical man with experience as a Pinkerton detective, before settling in Colorado, began a discreet inquiry. He reviewed the available employment records and compared them with the registry of residence at the boarding house, which the sisters were required to maintain for tax purposes. His findings, documented in a report discovered in the Gilpin County Archives in 1964, revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the course of 27 months, 17 men had reportedly left the Wakefield boarding house without notice, and none had collected their final wages or been seen in neighboring communities. Sheriff Buchanan's background in investigative work distinguished him from the typical frontier lawman. Before coming to Colorado, he had spent 8 years with the Pinkerton Agency, primarily working on cases of fraud and embezzlement in Chicago and St. Louis. This experience had cultivated both a methodical approach to evidence and a skepticism regarding coincidence. His handwritten notes, preserved alongside his official report, reveal his growing suspicion. The pattern exceeds probability. These men vanish without trace, yet leave behind earned wages, behavior contrary to the nature of working men. The Wakefield women provide identical explanations for each disappearance, as though reciting from an established script. Something is not right in that house. On April 7, 1872, Sheriff Buchanan paid an official visit to the Wakefield boarding house. According to his report, Margaret received him in the parlor, a room he described as fanatically neat, yet somehow unnatural, as though arranged for show rather than use. When presented with the discrepancies in her registry, Margaret provided plausible explanations for each departure. Some men had mentioned plans to try the silver mines in Nevada. Others had spoken of returning east. None had left forwarding addresses, which she attributed to the transient nature of mining life. Buchanan noted that Margaret maintained perfect composure throughout their conversation, referring occasionally to a small notebook she kept in her pocket. Her explanations were detailed and specific, citing destinations, motivations, and even snippets of conversations that seemed designed to establish the voluntary nature of each departure. Only when Buchanan inquired about the uncollected wages did she display momentary discomfort, suggesting that perhaps the men had forgotten in their haste or had made arrangements for the funds to be forwarded that had not been properly executed. Buchanan requested permission to speak with the current boarders and inspect the premises. Margaret agreed to the former, but politely declined the latter, citing concerns for her sister's delicate nervous condition and the privacy of her tenants. She did, however, invite him to return for Sunday dinner, when all the boarders would be present. In the interim between these visits, Buchanan made inquiries at the local stagecoach office, the livery stable, and among freighters who regularly traveled between mining communities. None recalled transporting any of the missing men, though such records were informally kept at best. He also wrote to colleagues in Virginia City, Nevada, and Denver, requesting information about any of the men who had supposedly relocated to those areas. These inquiries would prove fruitless, but demonstrated Buchanan's thoroughness. Sheriff Buchanan returned as suggested and was introduced to the 12 men then residing at the boarding house. In his report, he noted that the men appeared healthy if somewhat subdued. When questioned individually about former residents, they provided vague, nearly identical responses. They recalled the men in question, but had no knowledge of their plans or destinations. None reported anything unusual about the boarding house or its proprietors. Buchanan found their uniformity of response suspicious, but had no grounds for further investigation without evidence of wrongdoing. What particularly struck Buchanan was the physical condition of the current boarders. In his notes, he observed, "All present displayed a similar pallor and lassitude that they attributed to the nature of their employment. Yet I have encountered many miners in my time here, and while the work is undeniably taxing, It typically produces weather-beaten complexions and robust appetites rather than the wan delicacy I observed today. Several men exhibited small bandages on their arms or necks, which Miss Margaret explained as minor injuries sustained in the course of their work. The meal itself was simple but substantial: roast beef, potatoes, and bread, with apple pie for dessert. Buchanan noted that Elizabeth Wakefield did not join the company, but remained in the kitchen, visible only when bringing dishes to the table. Her appearance confirmed Reverend Whitmore's report of illness. She moved slowly and kept her gaze downcast, responding to her sister's instructions with silent compliance. The sheriff found himself unable to reconcile this subdued figure with the woman Grayson had described encountering in the hallway at night. As he prepared to depart, Buchanan requested use of the outhouse. Directed to the rear of the property, he took the opportunity to observe the grounds. Behind the main house stood a small outbuilding that Elizabeth Wakefield was entering as he watched. Beyond that lay a vegetable garden, meticulously maintained despite the early spring season. Most notably, Buchanan observed an area of disturbed earth near the garden's edge, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet in dimension. In his report he noted, "The soil appears to have been recently turned, though no plantings are evident." When questioned about this, Miss Margaret explained that they were preparing a new bed for root vegetables, delayed by the late frost. This observation, combined with the accumulated irregularities he had documented, convinced Buchanan that further investigation was warranted. In his private notes, he wrote, "The evidence remains circumstantial, but the pattern is clear to any who would see it. Men enter that house and do not leave, whatever story is told. I believe I have discovered the final repository of at least one such unfortunate. Tomorrow I shall return with the authority to examine the entire property, including that freshly turned earth." Sheriff Buchanan's suspicions were sufficiently aroused that he returned the following day with a warrant to search the premises. He arrived to find the boarding house engulfed in flames. The fire, which had apparently begun in the kitchen, spread rapidly through the wooden structure. Despite efforts by the town's volunteer fire brigade, the building was destroyed. Margaret Wakefield perished in the blaze. Her body was recovered from the parlor, where she had presumably been overcome by smoke while attempting to save household valuables. Eyewitness accounts of the fire, recorded in the April 12, 1872 edition of the Central City Register, describe a scene of chaos and confusion. The alarm was raised shortly after dawn by a milk delivery boy who observed smoke pouring from the kitchen windows. By the time the volunteer brigade assembled, flames had engulfed the rear of the structure and were spreading rapidly toward the front. The boarders, most of whom had already departed for their morning shifts, returned to find their residence and possessions destroyed. Elizabeth Wakefield was nowhere to be found. Initial assumptions that she too had perished were dispelled when a thorough search of the ruins yielded no additional remains. The boarders, all of whom had been at their places of employment when the fire began, were interviewed again. None could offer any insight into Elizabeth's whereabouts or the cause of the fire. A cursory investigation concluded that the blaze had resulted from a kitchen accident, though Sheriff Buchanan noted his skepticism in his private correspondence. In a letter to his former supervisor at the Pinkerton Agency, dated April 20th, 1872, Buchanan wrote, "The convenience of this fire strains credulity. That it should occur precisely when investigation became inevitable suggests deliberate action rather than misfortune. I cannot prove that the surviving sister set the blaze to eliminate evidence and facilitate her escape, but I would wager my badge upon it. The question that haunts me is whether her sibling's death was planned or incidental, and whether those men still resident in the house were intended to perish as well." In the aftermath, attention turned to the outbuilding that had survived the fire. A search revealed it to be a laundry facility containing washing tubs, a copper boiler, and implements for ironing and mending. Nothing unusual was discovered until Sheriff Buchanan noticed that the dimensions of the interior did not match those of the exterior. Further investigation revealed a false wall concealing a small room which contained a cot, a trunk of women's clothing, and a journal belonging to Elizabeth Wakefield. The discrepancy was discovered when Buchanan, whose engineering knowledge was rudimentary but adequate, measured the external dimensions of the structure and compared them with the visible interior space. Finding a difference of approximately 5 feet along the northern wall, he ordered a more thorough examination. The false wall, constructed of wooden planks painted to match the surrounding surfaces, was revealed by tapping along the wall and noting the hollow sound produced. Behind it lay what appeared to be living quarters, suggesting that Elizabeth sometimes resided separately from the main house. The journal, preserved now in the Colorado State Archives, provides disturbing insight into the sisters' operations. Written in a neat, precise hand, it detailed the cleansing of the boarding house residents. Elizabeth described a process of reformation that began with dietary restrictions and progressed to more invasive measures. She wrote of administering sedatives in evening meals, conducting nighttime procedures to remove moral contamination, and disposing of those deemed irredeemable. The opening pages establish Elizabeth's self-perception as a medical practitioner following in her father's footsteps. She wrote, "Father's research, though interrupted by his untimely passing, provided the foundation upon which our work continues. His understanding of the relationship between moral corruption and blood composition was revolutionary, if unappreciated by his narrow-minded colleagues. Margaret and I have been entrusted with his legacy, the purification of mankind through selective intervention. Subsequent entries detail the evolution of their methodology. Initial efforts focused on dietary modifications, with Elizabeth carefully documenting the effects of various restrictions on the boarder's behavior and appearance. She noted that the elimination of red meat produced a general tractability and diminished aggressive tendencies, while increased consumption of certain herbal preparations resulted in heightened susceptibility to suggestion. These observations led to more direct interventions. Most chilling were the methodical entries recording the names of former boarders, the dates of their departures, and the location of their remains. According to Elizabeth's journal, none of the missing men had left Blackhawk alive. Instead, they had been buried in the garden, beneath the root cellar, and in the walls of the attic. The excavations that followed confirmed her accounts. 17 bodies were eventually recovered from the property, many showing evidence of systematic bloodletting and surgical experimentation. The journal entry concerning Samuel Thatcher, the first victim, reveals the experimental nature of their early efforts. Initial subject responded poorly to the procedure, expiring before significant observations could be recorded. The quantity of extraction appears to have been excessive for his constitution. Margaret expresses concern about disposal, but I have assured her that the garden soil will accept him without difficulty. Future subjects will receive graduated treatments to determine optimal protocols. Elizabeth's clinical detachment extended to detailed observations of her victims' final moments. She documented changes in pulse, respiration, and skin color with scientific precision, occasionally expressing disappointment when subjects expired prematurely, or satisfaction when they demonstrated exceptional resilience. Nowhere in the journal is there evidence of remorse or recognition of her victims' humanity. They are consistently referred to as subjects, or by assigned numbers rather than names. The journal revealed that Elizabeth considered herself a medical practitioner of sorts, though she had no formal training. She wrote of purifying the blood and extracting moral weakness through phlebotomy and other invasive procedures. Margaret was portrayed as the more practical sister, concerned primarily with maintaining appearances and managing the financial aspects of their enterprise. Together, they had selected victims based on criteria that Elizabeth termed susceptibility to improvement, men without family connections who would not be missed. Particularly disturbing were Elizabeth's descriptions of her experiments with transfusion. In later entries, she documented attempts to transfer blood from one subject to another, believing that this might concentrate either purity or corruption for more effective treatment. These procedures invariably resulted in the death of the recipient, which Elizabeth attributed to insufficient refinement of technique, rather than the fundamental impossibility of her approach, given the medical knowledge of the era. Elizabeth Wakefield was never found. A statewide manhunt in the months following the fire yielded no trace of her. Rumors placed her in various locations throughout the West, often in connection with unexplained disappearances or unusual deaths. The most credible sighting occurred in San Francisco in 1880, where a boarding house proprietress matching her description vanished following the deaths of several tenants. However, no definitive connection was established. Sheriff Buchanan devoted considerable resources to the search, corresponding with law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Territories and as far east as Chicago. He developed a theory that Elizabeth had planned her escape well in advance of the fire, establishing a new identity and location to continue her work. In his final report on the case, filed in October 1872 before his reassignment to Denver, he wrote, "I believe Elizabeth Wakefield to be among the most dangerous criminals I have encountered in my career. Her combination of intelligence, medical knowledge, and complete absence of moral restraint makes her capable of continued atrocities wherever she may establish herself. Her victims, chosen for their isolation from family and community, represent the most vulnerable class of men in our expanding nation. I fear that unless she is apprehended, her experiments will continue indefinitely." The case of the Wakefield sisters might have faded into obscurity had it not been for an archaeological survey conducted in 1968 by the University of Colorado. During excavation of a historic site in what had once been Blackhawk, researchers discovered a sealed metal container beneath the foundation stones of what had been the Wakefield boarding house. Inside was a second journal belonging to Elizabeth Wakefield, covering the period immediately following her escape from Blackhawk. The discovery occurred during what was intended as a routine examination of mining-era architecture. The university team, led by Dr. Alan Merritt, had selected the site based on town records indicating it had once housed a substantial structure dating to the earliest period of the settlement's development. The foundation stones, still visible despite decades of subsequent construction and demolition, suggested a building of unusual size for the era. Initial excavation revealed typical artifacts of 19th century domestic life, fragments of ceramics, glass bottles, rusted implements, and personal items such as buttons and pins. The metal container was unearthed from beneath a cornerstone on the northern edge of the foundation. Approximately 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 4 inches deep, it had been sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth, protecting its contents from moisture. Its deliberate placement and careful preservation suggested that it had been intended for eventual recovery, perhaps by Elizabeth herself, should circumstances allow her return. This document, which remains partially classified in university archives, reportedly details Elizabeth's journey through the Western Territories and her continued practice. According to those who have reviewed its contents, she described establishing at least 3 additional boarding houses under assumed names, continuing her experiments with increasing sophistication. She expressed no remorse for her actions, instead detailing her advances in moral surgery with clinical detachment. The journal begins with an entry dated April 10, 1872, the day of the fire, in which Elizabeth describes her decision to expedite departure following Sheriff Buchanan's visit. She wrote, "M's hesitation has become a liability. Her concerns regarding official scrutiny betray a fundamental misunderstanding of our purpose. The work cannot be interrupted for such worldly considerations. I have therefore arranged for a conclusive resolution that will eliminate both the accumulating evidence and the necessity of convincing M of our proper course. The preparations made these past months for eventual relocation will now prove their value." This passage suggests that Margaret's death was not accidental, but rather a calculated element of Elizabeth's escape plan, confirmation of Sheriff Buchanan's suspicions. Subsequent entries detail her journey eastward by stagecoach using documentation she had prepared in advance under the name Eleanor Phillips. She traveled first to Denver, then to Cheyenne, and eventually to St. Louis, where she remained for several months while establishing her new identity. Elizabeth's methodology evolved during this period of transition. Having lost access to her father's original research and her own accumulated notes, she reconstructed her techniques from memory while incorporating new elements inspired by more recent medical publications. She documented visits to medical libraries in St. Louis, where she studied texts on bloodletting, transfusion, and surgical techniques under the guise of being a physician's widow with a scholarly interest. By early 1873, she had relocated to a small community outside Springfield, Illinois, where she purchased a modest house and began accepting boarders. Her operation there appears to have been more restrained, with only 3 documented victims over an 18-month period. Elizabeth attributed this reduced activity to the necessity of establishing irreproachable respectability before resuming full-scale experimentation. In 1875, following what she described as unwelcome inquiries from local authorities regarding one of her missing boarders, Elizabeth sold her Illinois property and moved westward again. The journal documents subsequent establishments in Nebraska, Wyoming, and eventually California, each operating for periods of 1 to 3 years before circumstances necessitated relocation. In each case, she refined her approach, becoming increasingly selective in her choice of victims and more sophisticated in her disposal methods. The final entry, dated October 1893, describes her intention to relocate to Chicago to take advantage of the crowds drawn by the World's Columbian Exposition. She wrote, "The great gathering presents unprecedented opportunities for my work. Among so many transient souls, the absence of a few will scarcely register. I have secured premises on the city's western edge, convenient to both the exhibition grounds and suitable disposal locations. The influx of medical practitioners for the Congress provides ideal cover for acquisition of necessary supplies. Father's vision approaches fulfillment, the purification proceeds." The journal ends abruptly, leaving unanswered questions about her ultimate fate. Historical records confirm that a boarding house at the address Elizabeth mentioned did indeed operate during the Columbian Exposition, owned by a woman calling herself Eleanor Phillips. City directories list the establishment as active until 1895, after which it disappears from records. Whether Elizabeth continued her activities beyond this point remains unknown. The legacy of the Wakefield sisters extends beyond their immediate victims. In 1968, researchers attempted to trace the genealogy of the sisters, hoping to understand the origins of their pathology. Records indicated that they were indeed siblings born to a respected physician in Philadelphia. Their mother had died in childbirth with Elizabeth, and their father had raised them in isolation, reportedly conducting unorthodox medical experiments in his home laboratory. After his death in 1868, the sisters sold his practice and traveled west with their inheritance. Dr. Jonathan Wakefield, their father, emerges from historical records as a figure of some controversy within Philadelphia medical circles. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in 1832, he initially established a conventional practice focusing on surgical techniques. By the 1850s, however, his interests had shifted toward what contemporary sources described as investigations into the physical manifestation of moral character, a pseudoscientific approach that combined elements of phrenology, bloodletting, and early theories of hereditary criminality. Several medical journal articles authored by Wakefield survive in university archives, though they appeared primarily in obscure publications after mainstream medical journals rejected his work. In these writings, he advocated for the theory that moral corruption physically altered the composition of human blood, and that such corruption could be removed through carefully controlled bloodletting and transfusion procedures. His ideas found little support among his peers, who increasingly regarded him as a fringe figure whose methods bordered on quackery. Philadelphia court records from 1862 indicate that Wakefield was briefly investigated following the death of a patient under his care, though no charges were ultimately filed due to insufficient evidence of negligence. This incident appears to have further isolated him from the medical establishment and may have contributed to his retreat into private research conducted in his home laboratory. Former colleagues interviewed as part of a 1969 dissertation on 19th-century medical practices recalled that Wakefield had involved his daughters in his work from an early age, particularly after his wife's death. Perhaps most disturbing are the indications that Elizabeth Wakefield may have had disciples. The University of Colorado researchers identified at least 2 unsolved crime series between 1890 and 1920 that bore striking similarities to the Wakefield methodology. In Denver and later in Seattle, Boardinghouse residents disappeared under circumstances suggesting a pattern learned from Elizabeth's techniques. Whether these were copycat crimes inspired by rumors or evidence of direct tutelage remains uncertain. The Denver case, which occurred between 1898 and 1900, involved a boarding house on the city's north side where at least 5 men vanished over an 18-month period. The proprietress, who used the name Margaret Wilson, disappeared shortly after police began investigating the disappearances. Excavation of the property revealed human remains beneath the floorboards of the coal cellar, displaying evidence of systematic bloodletting, similar to that documented in the Wakefield case. In Seattle, a more extensive series of disappearances occurred between 1911 and 1915, centered on a waterfront boarding house catering to seasonal workers in the fishing and logging industries. The establishment's owner, Sarah Grimes, maintained detailed ledgers recording the arrival and supposed departure of dozens of men, many of whom were later determined to have vanished without trace. When authorities finally investigated in 1915, they discovered a hidden room containing surgical instruments and notebooks documenting blood purification procedures in language strikingly similar to Elizabeth Wakefield's writings. The site where the Wakefield boarding house once stood has been developed multiple times over the intervening years. Currently, it houses a small museum dedicated to mining history with no mention of the atrocities that occurred there. Local tourism materials omit the Wakefield case entirely, focusing instead on the gold rush prosperity that defined the region's early years. Yet the case continues to haunt those who study the darker aspects of frontier history. The calculated nature of the sisters' enterprise, its longevity, the complicity of survivors, and the methodical documentation suggests a form of evil more disturbing than impulsive violence. The Wakefield sisters operated not as outlaws, but as respected members of a community, hiding in plain sight while systematically eliminating those society had already rendered invisible. What remains perhaps most unsettling is the incompleteness of the resolution. While Margaret Wakefield met her end in the fire that consumed her establishment, Elizabeth vanished into the anonymity of an expanding nation. Her final journal suggests she a woman not fleeing justice, but methodically continuing her work, unhampered by conscience or fear of discovery. The true extent of her activities may never be known, nor can we be certain that her influence ended with her presumed death. In the silence that follows this account, one might consider the thin veneer of civilization that existed in the mining communities of 1870s Colorado, how isolation and the promise of prosperity created environments where predators could operate undetected. One might also reflect on how easily the disappearances of unimportant men were dismissed, their absences explained away by the transient nature of frontier existence. The boarding houses that still stand in former mining towns throughout the American West serve as unintentional monuments to those who passed through their doors and were forgotten. Behind their weathered facades lie stories of ordinary lives, and occasionally, as in the case of the Wakefield sisters, extraordinary horrors long hidden beneath respectable appearances.